Decades ago, I worked nights as a campus police officer at Georgetown University in D.C. Some kids were snobby, and the uniforms weren't flattering, but overall it was a good gig. Well, except for one night, my first night on the job. I was at the security station when dispatch got a call. Allen was at it again. My sergeant explained, most days this senior named Allen was quiet, kinda sad, kept his head down, didn't go out much. But every few weeks he'd show up at a bar or house party, get wasted, and lose his damn mind. He'd cry, or scream, or dance like a maniac. He never hurt anyone, but he sure did freak people out. Since Allen's father was a notable professor, there was a procedure in place. Escort Allen out of the party and back to the station. Then let him sleep it off until Daddy came to collect him. And guess who was the lucky officer who got to do that tonight? Yep, me. So 10 minutes later, I dragged this Allen kid out of a frat house and headed for the station. At first, he kept wriggling from my grip, giggling, his eyes wide and very red. He flailed around like he was a puppet, and someone else was pulling the strings. But a few minutes later, Allen got quiet. He muttered that he was really sorry, and I knew he wasn't lying. I told Allen that it wasn't my place, and maybe he should get help. Being wasted on the regular was a messed up norm in college, but in the real world, it was called alcoholism, and it was a sickness. Allen shook his head and said I didn't get it. What he had wasn't a sickness. Then he grabbed my arm and looked right at me, and I swear, his eyes turned red. It's not a sickness, it's a curse. You're listening to Run, Fool. I'm Rodney Barnes, and this is episode 54, The Bottle Tree. Three years before the night we met, Allen stumbled into his Georgetown University dorm at 3 a.m. The freshman was buzzed after a wild party, celebrating the end of finals. He was about to nuke a half-eaten burrito in the microwave when he saw a red blinking light on his answering machine. For those of you too young to know what that is, it's where we got voicemails before we all had cell phones. Allen rushed over to play it. He hoped it was from a girl he had given his number to a few days ago. No such luck. It was a message from his 10-year-old sister, Molly. She was usually a firecracker, but she sounded kind of tense now. She said she wanted him to come visit this summer, to spend time with her and their dad, Ted. Something about Molly's tone rattled Allen. On instinct, he muttered, "No way." Allen grew up near D.C., but his family was spending the year at their grandpa's old house in Beaufort, a city on Port Royal Island off the coast of South Carolina. His dad had taken a sabbatical from teaching at Georgetown to grieve. 6 months ago, Allen's mom was killed in a car crash, a freak accident on her way to pick up Molly from baseball practice. After the funeral, Allen's dad asked him to take time off from school too, so they could move through those first terrible few months together. But Allen couldn't bear that idea. So he fled back to college. He ignored most of his dad's calls. He threw himself into parties and drinking and mischief. Anything to escape. Anything to feel whole. Allen didn't want to see his family. He didn't want to face how different things would be now. But then, he stared down at the stale burrito in his hand and got to thinking. Truth was, he was broke, with no summer job lined up. If he went to Beaufort for a week, played the dutiful son, and asked his dad for some cash, he could go back to D.C. and have fun for the rest of the summer. Then everyone would be happy, right? A week later, Allen heaved his bag out of a cab and watched it speed off. He was already sweating in the Beaufort summer heat until a breeze blew in from the bay. For a second, he thought of happier times. He and his mom hunting for shells in the sand. His dad perched on the dock, a book in one hand, baby Molly in the other. He shook off the memory and turned to his grandpa's rambling house. The bushes and grass grew wild, The roof sagged, and the paint was peeling. The porch ceiling used to be painted a special shade of blue. Haint blue, his mom called it. Gullah legends said it warded off evil spirits from entering homes. Now the color was almost gone. Alan stepped to the side of the house and saw another protection against evil. The bottle tree, one he'd made with his mom as a kid. A bent steel structure with blue glass bottles as branches. The color was said to entrance spirits, so they'd get trapped in the bottles. But now, the bottles were shattered, all jagged edges. Maybe Alan's dad didn't care. Why worry about spirits when grief had already invaded their lives? The door opened and Molly raced out. She hugged Alan and told him he'd gotten chubby. Alan groaned. Yeah, he'd had a bit of a beer belly, but she didn't have to be rude. He was about to tell Molly she'd gotten uglier when he heard footsteps. Molly gripped Alan tighter as their dad shuffled out. Despite the heat, Alan shivered. His dad looked hollow. It was like seeing a broken future version of himself. Ted gave both his kids a half-hearted hug. Alan thought it was weird that Molly wriggled free, but he stayed in his dad's tentative embrace. He sort of owed him that. If there's one thing Alan was looking forward to this visit, it was his dad's home cooking. So he was disappointed when Ted threw together a pot of instant mac and cheese, the kind Alan practically OD'd on at school. Still, Alan set the table, his old dinner-time duty. He caught himself taking 4 bowls out. He shook his head, then put one back. He wasn't used to setting a table for 3. Or, as it turned out, for 2. Because once Alan slapped mac and cheese into 2 bowls, he said he was sorry. He had to go out for a bit to the local bar. The manager had just lost his son. Ted knew about grief, so he was helping him out. Kind of like therapy. Alan sighed. His dad was always so selfless. It made him feel like trash. Molly told her dad that Alan was home, so he should stay. Ted seemed troubled, antsy. He looked at Alan like it was his decision. Alan winced. It was depressing to be around his dad. If it was just him and Molly, it might feel less grim. So Alan said it was fine. They had lots of time to catch up. Ted hurried out, and Molly shot Alan a look, like he had betrayed her. Alan figured she was being a moody preteen, so he told her to cheer up. The place was theirs. They had to resurrect their tradition of watching the creepiest movie they could find on cable. It was Alan's God-given right as a big brother to scare the crap out of her, after all. Molly said no. She didn't want to be afraid tonight. Instead, she made them watch cheesy sitcoms about picture-perfect families where both parents were alive, where every problem was solved in half an hour. Alan was bored, and oddly, Molly didn't seem too hooked either. Her eyes kept darting between the clock and the front door. Clock, door, clock, door. When the clock hit 9, Molly jumped from the couch and said she was going to sleep. Alan laughed. For years, Molly had complained about her early bedtime. She was a big kid now, so she had to keep him company until Dad came home. Molly said she didn't want to be awake for that. Alan frowned. What does she mean? Molly went quiet. Then she stared into her brother's eyes. She said their dad had gone out, but the bad man would be coming home. Can you name every single subscription you have? I know I can't name all of mine, and I'm not alone. I just learned that over 74% of people have subscriptions they've forgotten about. With Rocket Money, I don't have to remember every subscription or worry about forgetting any because I can see them all laid out right in front of me. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/run. That's rocketmoney.com/run. rocketmoney.com/run.
This episode is brought to you by HelloFresh. Be honest. Between meetings, workout classes, and the kids' clubs, who's got time to cook? That's where HelloFresh comes in. No matter how busy you get, HelloFresh makes it easy to get a home-cooked meal on the table. With flavor-packed recipes like crispy chicken parmigiana, you'll be filling your kitchen with the cozy aromas of a homemade meal in no time. Visit HelloFresh.ca and use code SPOTIFY for your exclusive offer.
Alan stood up, unnerved. He asked Molly, what does she mean by the bad man? Molly whispered, on some nights, their dad changed, especially after being at the bar. He'd act strange, loopy, cheerful one minute, cruel the next. And the next morning, he'd pretend like nothing happened, like he'd forgotten it all. Alan frowned. It sounded like a blackout to him, and he'd had a few of those at school. His dad had never been a big drinker, but his grandpa had been. He wondered if his dad had developed the same issue. He needed reassurance, so he asked Molly when Dad got like this. He never hurt her, right? Molly said no, but sometimes she felt like a part of him really wanted to. That didn't reassure Alan. Suddenly, through the open window, he heard distant footsteps, and their father, humming an old jazz tune, the kind their mom loved. When Alan turned back to Molly, he saw that she was halfway up the stairs. He raced after her and found her in her bedroom. She turned out the light. Her covers were pulled up, and she'd squeezed her eyes shut. Alan heard the door open downstairs. His dad called out their names in an eerie sing-song way, and the lights in the room flickered, on, then off. Molly whispered over and over, "Tell him I'm asleep. Tell him I'm asleep." Even though this all felt nuts, Alan said he would. Then he went into the hall and shut her door. Footsteps thudded up the stairs, and the weird thing was, they sounded doubled, like there were two people coming up. Thump-thump, 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 thump-thump. When Ted stepped up on the landing, Alan half expected to see the boogeyman, but it was just his dad. Ted lit up with a smile and stumbled over to Alan. His eyes were red-rimmed, almost crimson. They went wide like he was seeing his son for the first time. He hugged him tight, nothing like the feeble hug he'd given him earlier. It was almost nice, until Alan got a whiff of tequila and gagged. He pulled away and asked, was he drunk? Ted shrugged, loose and good-natured. He'd had a few at the bar.
Nothing wrong with that. Right.
Then, Ted's smile curdled into a sneer, and he asked where Molly was. Alan said she was asleep, and Ted snorted. He knocked on Molly's door, hard. He said it wasn't polite to go to bed without saying goodnight. When she didn't answer, Ted barged into the room. He marched to her bed, ordering her to wake up, yelling her name louder and louder. Alan ran in and pulled his dad back. Why was he doing this to Molly? Ted whipped around, and Alan screamed. His dad's eyes were blood red, and his voice was an echoing guttural rasp.
She did this to me.
The light bulb above exploded. Sparks rained down, and Alan dove to the floor. When he looked up, his dad was gone. Alan scrambled up, cutting his hand on a shard from the bulb. He swallowed the pain and ran to the hall, just in time to see Ted shuffle into his room and lock the door. Alan wanted to follow, but honestly, he was too freaked out. He turned away and jumped when he saw Molly in her doorway. She told Alan now he'd met the bad man, and the bad man was right. This was her fault. Molly was certain that her father was possessed by a spirit she'd set free when she broke the bottle tree. A few minutes later, Alan and Molly crept outside to stare at the shattered bottle tree. Molly explained, when they came to Beaufort months ago, the tree was whole, just like it was when Alan and their mom had made it. The sight comforted her. It was a promise that their family was protected here. But then, Alan stopped calling home, and their dad sank into his own grief. Soon the bottle tree enraged Molly. The idea that dumb Law and Order could stop bad things from hurting her family felt like a lie, especially when her family was so good at hurting itself. So one night, she took a baseball bat to it. Breaking it made her feel better, until a storm erupted out of nowhere. As lightning crackled, Molly saw something. A red ball of light escaped a shattered bottle. It shot up to the house, right into Dad's bedroom window. Soon after that, Ted started hanging out at the bar. And now, the bad man lurked inside of their dad, hollowing him out with every passing day. Alan told Molly she was wrong. The dad wasn't possessed. He just drank a lot because he was sad. It was grief 101. Molly argued, "What about the lights? The exploding bulb?" Alan stammered, "It was just bad wiring in an old house." Molly scoffed, but Alan told her not to worry. Tomorrow, while she was at her baseball day camp, he talked to their dad, tell him he needed to control himself, or go to AA, or something. Alan promised he'd make everything okay. Molly stared up at him, way too jaded for a 10-year-old. "You mean okay enough so you can leave again?" The next day, Alan drove Molly to camp. Then he spent a couple hours cruising around aimlessly, feeling sorry for himself, because Molly was right. He'd only come to play the good son and get some cash, in and out, quick and easy. Now he had to figure out if his dad was a drunk or a demon, or if his little sister had just lost her mind. Either way, Alan felt like he was going to be trapped with his family, with no way out. He really wished his mom was here to guide him. When Alan got home, he thought he'd have to drag his dad out of bed and give him a talking to. But Ted was out on the porch, grilling, showered, clean-shaven, and waving his son over to have a hot dog and a corn cob. Feeling hesitant, Alan took a seat at the table. His dad sipped a big glass of sweet tea as he poured Alan one from a frosty pitcher. It was caring, fatherly. Last night's danger felt like a distant nightmare. Until Alan took a gulp. Then he choked, because this wasn't sweet tea. This was a boozy Long Island iced tea. Alan spit it out and asked, "Was Ted getting wasted on a Saturday morning?" Ted shrugged. Alan was off at college doing his keg stands every night. Ted was giving his son space, letting him have fun. Was it a crime for Ted to blow off steam too? Alan said there was a difference. He was a kid. Ted was a dad. And he was a mean drunk last night. He scared Molly so much she thought he was a demon. The word hung in the air. Then, Ted's eyes flitted to the corner of the yard where the broken bottle tree was, which sent a shiver down Alan's spine. Ted took a sip of his drink and chuckled.
Do you think I'm a demon, son?
Suddenly, Alan felt like an idiot. He muttered, "Of course not. He was just here to make sure everyone was okay." Ted swallowed his cocktail and poured another. Oh, please. He'd been watching Alan's checking account all semester. It was no coincidence that as soon as the balance hit zero, Alan was here and pretending to care. He bet if he wrote Alan a fat check right now, he'd take the money and run, wouldn't he? It was like Ted had ripped his head open to peer into his mind. Alan couldn't tell if that was a demon power, a drunk power, or just a dad power. Either way, the truth cut deep. Alan said Ted was right. He deserved this cruelty, but Molly didn't. Ted slurred in disgust.
Molly this, Molly that. Molly needs clothes. Molly needs hugs. Molly misses her mom. Molly misses Alan. Molly needs another uniform for her stupid baseball obsession. Well, if Molly's mom didn't have to go pick her up from practice that night 6 months ago, maybe she'd still be alive. Maybe she wouldn't have come home in a body bag.
Ted's eyes burned red, and he slammed the table in rage. The porch shook. and the last remaining flecks of haint blue paint from the ceiling rained down on them. That paint was meant to ward off spirits, and when the flecks hit Ted, his skin sizzled. Alan gasped, and Ted fell to the ground. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he stood tall, suddenly calm. He told Alan if he was so worried for Molly, he could take care of her. Ted was going to rustle up some fun at the bar. Ted stumbled off while Alan sat back, certain now that his dad was possessed. It wasn't the red eyes or the sizzling skin. It was the fact that Ted would never blame Molly for her mother's death. He was too good of a man. No, a demon was wearing his dad's face and using booze to twist his thoughts. Alan looked at the flecks of haint blue paint. He picked up a few as an idea came together. He thought he'd have to stage an intervention. Turns out, it was time for an exorcism. For a gift that's always on time and lasts a lifetime, you can't do better than Masterclass. With Masterclass, your loved ones can learn from the best to become their best. Masterclass is the only streaming platform where you can learn and grow with over 200 of the world's best. That's why Wirecutter calls it an invaluable gift. Use behavioral science to read people from FBI profiler John Douglas, uncover the truth with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Bob Woodward, or successfully negotiate any situation with FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss. Learning is the most important aspect of human evolution. As I go through life, I never want to stop learning, and Masterclass has been an incredible aid in achieving that goal. Masterclass always has great offers during the holidays, sometimes up to as much as 50% off. Head over to masterclass.com/fool for the current offer. That's up to 50% off at masterclass.com/fool. masterclass.com/fool.
At New Balance, we believe if you run, you're a runner, however you choose to do it. Because when you're not worried about doing things the right way, you're free to discover your way. Come and be a winner. And that's what running's all about. Run your way at newbalance.com/running.
As soon as the demon left, Alan leapt into action. He raced into the car, then drove to Molly's camp to pull her out. She was bewildered until Alan told her she was right. Their dad was possessed. Molly burst into tears. All this chaos was her fault for breaking the bottle tree. Alan held her close and told her it really was his fault. He should have stayed. He should have protected her and their dad. Now, he was going to make things right. First, they'd go to the hardware store, then a craft store. After that, they'd go home and wait for the bad man to come back for the last time. Late that night, Alan and Molly sat on the living room floor, holding hands. The lights were off, and they stared out the open windows, waiting. Molly whispered to Alan. She wasn't sure which was scarier, the thought of their dad coming back or the idea that he might not come back. What if they were really alone? Alan told Molly that they'd survive. She'd move into his dorm, and he'd bribe the Georgetown baseball team to hire her as a junior coach. Molly was about to smile when they heard footsteps outside and caught a glimpse of Ted, shambling up the walk, swinging from a half-empty bottle of vodka. He peered into the windows. In the darkness, his eyes glowed red. In an amused sing-song, he asked,
"Kids, where are you?"
Molly called out, "In here." Then Alan nodded, and she ran to get into position. The door swung open into the house, and Ted stood in the frame, silhouetted in shadow. He took a few plodding steps in, sounding like two men instead of one. Thump, 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 thump. Then Alan flicked the lights on. Ted looked down and let out a howl.
Ow!
A circle of hate blue paint surrounded him on the floor. The only place the paint didn't cover was the door's threshold. He was about to run back out when Alan cried Molly's name. She burst out from behind the front door, slammed it shut, and leapt out from the circle. Ted turned and howled again.
Ow!
Because the back of the door was slick with fresh blue paint. The demon was trapped. Alan ordered him to leave their father's body. If he did, he used paint thinner to erase part of the circle, and the demon could be free to terrorize some other family. The demon said he couldn't do that. Alan said fine. There was another option. Molly rushed in from the kitchen holding a small, lightweight Christmas tree, the kind you got at craft stores. Only this one's branches were decked out in cobalt blue bottles. It was a new homemade bottle tree. Molly set it on the edge of the paint circle. Ted looked enraptured. Like the Gullah legend said, the color entranced the demon. Alan gasped when his father's face shifted and stretched, like something inside it was being pulled out towards the bottles. Alan thought this plan was about to work when Ted stepped back, raised the vodka bottle in his hand, and threw it at the bottle tree. It toppled over and shattered. Molly fell back, terrified. Alan marched to the edge of the circle, full of rage. Why wouldn't this demon leave their dad alone? The demon rasped back, less angry, more exasperated.
I didn't say I wouldn't. I said I couldn't. Your father doesn't want me to leave.
Alan and Molly called the demon a liar. Their father would never want this abomination inside him. The demon shook his head.
That's just not true. Tell your kids, Ted.
Suddenly, he fell to the ground. His head jerked and his eyes faded to their usual brown. When he looked at them, Alan and Molly knew it was their dad, the real Ted. Ted looked heartbroken as he told them. He did want to keep the demon. The truth was, he couldn't do all of this alone. All those dark, cruel things the demon had said were true. They'd come from Ted's mind. His grief was ugly and unbearable, but he'd repressed it because he didn't want to upset Alan or Molly. The demon drove him to drink. The more Ted drank, the more control the demon had, and Ted realized he welcomed that. He got to escape into a dream state where he didn't have to think about anything. Maybe the demon in the drink made him numb, but that felt so much better than grief, and he wasn't strong enough to give it up. Molly looked heartbroken, but Alan told his dad to snap out of it. Alan couldn't take care of Molly. He was a crappy, selfish son who abandoned his family, who couldn't run a checking account, who cared more about his peace of mind than his own dad's grief. And Molly was 10, so she couldn't take care of herself either. They still needed a role model. They needed a father, even a broken one. Alan would do anything to make that happen. He'd take on more of his dad's duties and burdens if he just came back to them. Suddenly, Ted's face changed. The eyes glowed red, and the evil spirit asked,
Would Alan take on his dad's demons too?
Alan stepped back. He was pretty sure the demon wanted to possess him, and that felt like a step too far. He wasn't sure he was brave enough. The demon shrugged. It had to go somewhere. That's how it survived, dancing through generations of kin, sowing chaos and forcing them to give in to their worst impulses. If it wouldn't have Ted or Alan, maybe a little girl would be a fun new home. Alan realized the demon was after Molly now, the only member of this family who'd never let her grief turn her selfish or cruel. That was all it took. Alan told the demon, You're not hurting her. Take me. The demon smiled, then said,
Bottoms up.
A red-black vicious substance shot out of Ted's mouth. It flew into the air like a geyser of blood or wine. And then it went right down Alan's throat. Alan woke up 3 days later to his dad and Molly hugging and kissing him. It was more love than he'd felt in the last year, and the family actually seemed whole again. But eventually, Alan told them he needed a break. He wanted to slip out of the house, just to take a walk and process the last few days. Of course, Ted and Molly let him go. They didn't know he was lying, that he was headed straight for the bar. Alan didn't want to walk. He wanted a drink. Maybe then, the dark voice that had started whispering to him would be quiet. Three years later, I ushered a very drunk Alan across a shadowy nighttime path, headed for the campus security station. He'd just finished telling me this outrageous tale. It made me feel less sympathy for him. I told him he didn't have to make up this wild backstory to explain a drinking problem. Back then, I was still more or less convinced that demons weren't real. Alan didn't like that, and when his eyes glowed, I suddenly became way more open to the idea of literal demons existing. I stumbled back, worried he was going to attack, when something flew through the air and landed on the ground. A little cobalt blue glass bottle. Alan dove down, drawn to it, fascinated and scared. He barely noticed a girl, maybe 13 or 14, walk up, until she picked up the bottle, and Alan stood too. He blinked. His eyes went back to normal, and he looked like he had no idea how he'd gotten there. He asked, "Did you get him this time?" The girl shook her head. "No, but at least you're back in control." Then they walked off together. It was at this point that I realized my perp was being taken away, and I tried to go after them. Suddenly, a thin, academic-looking man in his 50s popped out from behind a tree. He said,
It's best to let my daughter handle Alan. She's gotten really good at, sobering him up.
He explained that he was a professor, and he was very sorry for the disturbance his son had caused. But he could take it from here. I asked, "Was he Ted? Was the girl Molly?" Ted nodded. Yes. They'd moved back to D.C. 2 years ago, so Alan could continue his education. When the beast reared its head every so often, it made things difficult, so he was grateful for my help and my discretion. I asked Ted, was there really a demon in his son? Ted nodded sadly. Yes. One he and Molly hated, but one they tolerated too. They had no choice, because Alan was kin. He'd given up a lot, taken on a burden and an addiction so Ted could get better and care for his family. So no matter how bad things got, Ted and Molly wouldn't give up on Alan. That would only give the demon and the drinking more power. Run Fool is a production of Ballen Studios, Campside Media, and At Will Media. It is hosted and executive produced by me, Rodney Barnes. This episode was written by Amin Osman and produced by Abakar Adan. Editing by Abakar Adan. Sound director, designer, and mixer is Kevin Seaman. Coordinating producer is Avery Siegel. Creature vocalization by Terry Cashburn. Artwork by Jessica Clarkston-Kiner. Production support by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. Special thanks to our operations team, Doug Slaywin, Ashley Warren, Sabina Mara, and Destiny Ding. Executive producers at Ballen Studios are MrBallen, Nick Witters, and Zach Levitt. Executive producer at Will Media is Will Malnati. Executive producers at Campside Media are Matt Scher, Josh Dean, Vanessa Gregoriadis, and Adam Hoff. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.